Thanks, Brother Dave, and good morning, everyone. At the outset, I must ask you to forgive the occasional cough and sniff. I've just recovered from 2 weeks of bronchitis, including several days when I lost my voice, and I found that all parental authority evaporates when you are reduced to squeaking angrily at your children. I would also like to apologise for making you pretend that it's evening in that last hymn on a 40-degree Sunday morning, but the themes and the language of that hymn are so beautiful, so powerful, and so moving, and they tie in well with my exhort, so I hope you'll excuse a little poetic licence. This morning we're going to be looking at Cain and Abel, which I concede does not immediately strike you as an exhortational theme. It's a tragedy, and it's a particularly shocking one. It's the first tragedy of Scripture, and it reflects humanity's insatiable lust for conflict, and it sets up a pattern for the rest of human history, an inescapable pattern, a pattern in which we find that humans are not just the most powerful animals on this planet, but also the most violent. No creature on earth exterminates its own kind in the way that humans do. No other creature absorbs so many resources, steals and commits violence unnecessarily. Humans are unique in this regard, and it all comes back to Genesis 4. And the story of Cain and Abel is traditionally examined from the standpoint of what happened to Abel and why. But I believe a greater lesson emerges when we look at what happened afterwards. So we're introduced to these two fated brothers in Genesis 4, verses 1 and 2. Cain is a farmer and Abel is a herdsman, but they are both local to each other, which tells us that Abel's lifestyle was not nomadic. They lived as part of a community. And at a certain time, offerings are due to God. We don't know what the purpose of these offerings was. It's not explicitly stated. They're not described as sacrifices, but as gifts. Nevertheless, there is a clearly implied expectation of excellence, and therein lies the problem. Because Cain, we are told, brings some of the fruit of the ground, verse 3, while Abel brings some of the firstborn of his flock, even the fattest of them, verse 4. And that emphasis is very deliberate. The implication is that Cain has taken less care over his offering, but Abel has presented the very best. And as we know, Cain's offering is rejected on this basis, and he becomes enraged. And in a gesture that foreshadows his later act of mercy, God does not respond in kind, but instead he attempts to reason with Cain. He says, "Why are you angry? And why is your expression downcast? Is it not true that if you do what is right, you will be fine? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to dominate you, but you must subdue it." And that is very powerful imagery. Sin characterized as a beast at the door. This subtly invokes Adam's superiority over the animal kingdom, and it implies that Cain will lose this status if he succumbs to sin. Cain, like Adam, you are dominant over the animals. Sin is just another animal. It wants to dominate you. You must subdue it. So Cain has a choice. He can control his emotions and retain his human nobility, or he can allow passion to consume him and become no better than the animals. He chooses the latter, and thus God's rejection of his offering becomes the catalyst for Abel's murder. Now, Cain's anger is actually directed at God, not Abel, but Abel, of course, is a convenient proxy. It's easy for him to transfer his anger onto the accepted one. By killing Abel, he hopes to reassert his status and prove that God is wrong. He wants to show that he is still a man. He is capable of conscious, autonomous decisions, for better or worse. He's not like the animals with their inferior intelligence, their pre-programmed instincts, and their lack of moral capacity. What Cain is doing is actually quite sophisticated. He wants to show that he can knowingly, deliberately make bad choices. He can knowingly, deliberately defy God. He is determined to prove that sin does not debase him as it did his father. He needs to convince himself that he has not relinquished the divine gift of rulership, and he will still not lose it, even if he defies God in this terrible sin. But his choice, as we know, has the opposite effect, because by succumbing to the beast at the door, Cain becomes the slave of sin. Look at the murder of Abel in verse 8. It's described in a single sentence, devoid of emotion and detail. The first murder recorded in Scripture. An incredible, shocking event, and yet it's thrown away in this almost careless fashion. And this is deliberate. It reflects the callous nature of Cain's crime. Cold, clinical, utterly devoid of conscience. The only thing fueling him is this blind, red-misted rage. It's intended to show us just how little Cain cared or thought about the consequences of what he had done. How carelessly he threw away a human life made in the image of God. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Cain is the world's first psychopath. And of course, God knows of Cain's sin, but he still gives him the opportunity to confess, just as he did with Adam. But when he's challenged by God, Cain is defiant. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother, Abel?" And he replied, "I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian?" And here Cain continues to maintain the fiction that he is in control. To what extent he still believes this is open to debate, but what we do know is that he felt sufficiently confident to stand his ground under God's cross-examination. So as prosecutor, God presents the evidence against Cain. The Lord said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." And the NET Bible has a nice little footnote that makes this explicit. It says the word voice is a personification. The evidence of Abel's shed blood condemns Cain, just as a human eyewitness would testify in court. Cain knew that blood was there. He had shed that blood. He'd wiped his hands of it. He'd walked away from the crime. And he thought so little of it that he was prepared to defy God and lie to him about what they both knew. As judge, God now convicts Cain and hands down his sentence. So now you are banished from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you try to cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its best for you. You will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. Here we have another bitter reversal that echoes the fate of Cain's father. Adam's commission was to care for the Garden of Eden, but he lost that commission when God expelled him from Eden. Similarly, Cain was a farmer, but now God causes the earth to resist him. His own commission, his self-chosen commission, becomes much harder than ever before. God is in control, and Cain needs to understand that. And the severity of this punishment in the cultural context of the ancient world, where in this period agriculture is basically the foundation of civilization, cannot be underestimated. And the punishment shocks Cain into an emotional outburst that is characteristic of his selfish nature. Then Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to endure. Look, you are driving me off the land today, and I must hide from your presence. I will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." But Cain's appeal is just another act of defiance, which has nothing to do with any sense of fair play, though he tries to pretend that it does. But despite this, God offers a concession. The Lord said to him, "All right then, if anyone kills Cain, Cain will be avenged 7 times as much." Then the Lord put a special mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would strike him down. Cain's original sentence still stands, but vigilantism has been outlawed. God reaffirms that he alone has the power of life and death, and thus Cain is marked to show that he is God's property. The vengeance that will result from the unlawful killing of Cain is not for Cain's sake, but for God's. The special mark is a sign that no matter how far Cain roams, God's face is still turned towards him. God's presence is still within Cain's reach. And in this act of grace, God proves that justice is at the heart of everything he does. We are told that when Cain left the presence of God, he lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Notice how far humans have now moved from the original biblical ideal. First Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. Now Cain moves east of Eden, further and further from this symbolic temple of God, the idyllic state of humanity in their original relationship with their Creator. Humanity has now begun to drift from God in a way that is inexorable, and it will have terrible consequences. Where is the land of Nod? Well, no one's really sure. It's never been unambiguously identified, but the NET Bible notes that the word Nod means wandering, which suggests this is actually a play on words. Cain leaves his family and enters the land of wanderers. He is a Nod in the land of Nods. And this reflects the damage caused by the loss of community and fellowship. It also implies that a life without God is aimless and utterly futile. True to form, Cain refuses to accept the fate of a nomad. In verse 17, he fathers a son and he begins to build a city. This signifies a desperate need to regain the stability that was lost as a result of his sin. But sadly, Cain never once considers rekindling his relationship with God, which is what he really needed to do. The tragedy of Cain and Abel is a microcosm of human strife throughout history. Brother against brother, tribe against tribe, nation against nation, and endless wars amongst and between believers and unbelievers alike. Coming so soon after the fall, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that this story is intended to drive home the inescapable consequences of Adam and Eve's sin. There's a grim predictability about the whole affair. We get the sense that Abel's death is virtually inevitable. It's going to happen because this is the way humans are going now. This is the path that we're on, thanks to Adam and Eve. It could have been different, but it wasn't. And if it hadn't been Cain and Abel, it would have been someone else and someone else. There's also a strong indication that the effects and the motivations of sin are compounded with each new generation. Notice the differences between Cain and his father. Adam is given dominion over the animals. Cain seeks dominion over his fellow humans. Adam is ashamed and confesses his sin. Cain is defiant and denies his sin. Adam accepts his punishment without complaint. Cain argues, protests, and appeals. Adam foreshadows Christ as the Son of God and firstborn of creation. And in 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul describes Jesus as the last Adam, making that connection explicit. But Cain becomes a representative of sin. And in John 8:44, Jesus describes him as the devil, a murderer from the beginning, a liar and the father of lies. But there's also a similarity in that both men deserved death, but were permitted to live. And the nature of their punishment held a special meaning, a message for them to learn from. And it reminds us that God is not willing that any should perish. In my previous exhort a few weeks ago, I showed how the increasing institutionalization of our faith can cause us to become disillusioned with our community and ultimately disconnected from it. And the solution I proposed was the formation of a community within a community, a group of like-minded people who recognise the problem, seek out those who are struggling, and provide pastoral support without judgment. And I'd like to suggest that this is effectively what God offered Cain by placing a protective mark upon him. He provided a way for Cain to at least rebuild relationships with his community. But Cain rejected this. He left his community and formed a new one, a community reflecting his own values and preferences, a community where he was in control, a community that did not require him to compromise or change his behaviour. Now, the temptation to follow Cain's example can be very strong, particularly if we feel that our community has wronged us deeply. And I say this with the proviso that there are times when our community forces people out against their will with no valid justification. There are times when reconciliation is simply impossible. But today I'm speaking specifically about the times when the decision is entirely our own. And we can justify this however we like. We might say, it's not my fault, it's their fault. I had to leave because remaining would be compromise, and I refused to compromise. They could have prevented this. It's all on them. I've got higher standards. I can't forgive what happened. And however else we want to justify our decision. We can always find reasons for walking away in these situations. We can persuade ourselves that we are choosing the nobler path, that we are taking the higher ground by avoiding conflict and removing ourselves from a community that's gone bad, or that's wronged us, or just doesn't quite meet what we think the community should be. But when the issue is this self-focused, this self-centered, and when the justifications are poor, this is not the nobler path. It is simply the easier path. The nobler path is the difficult path. The nobler path is to remain and seek reconciliation, to find ways of accommodating differences, to work towards greater understanding between the members of the body, to listen more than talking, to be humble and accept that we could be wrong. Diversity is healthy, and the original Christian community was incredibly diverse. Division is never the better way. Diverse communities grow, and the original Christian community grew faster than any other religious movement in its day. For 500 years it grew with such astonishing rapidity, even under brutal persecution, that the Romans eventually had to give in to it. Diverse communities grow, they flourish. Homogeneous communities remain static, they shrink, they divide. And small communities cannot afford to divide, and ours is, in global terms, a small community. The Apostle Paul was no stranger to these internal conflicts. And you will sometimes hear him unfairly characterized as a hard, dogmatic man who relentlessly imposed his own version of orthodoxy upon others. But in fact, the opposite is true. Paul was far more accommodating than he is often given credit for. Paul's instinct was to include, not exclude. He condemned those who restricted fellowship on the basis of arbitrary rules defined by a handful of influential power brokers. And that situation is described and explicitly condemned by the Apostle John in his third epistle. And as we go through the epistles of Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, and we look at the way the original Christian community dealt with differences, both moral and theological, we find that standards of orthodoxy were, to coin a phrase, more generous in Paul's day than they are in our own modern community. And there were reasons for this. The plurality of peoples, of cultures, of ideas, that people's backgrounds made this necessary. The original conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles, the need to mesh these two divergent communities, made it necessary to find compromises and to seek unity on the basis of essential truths, rather than hammering down every jot and tittle as they'd been accustomed to doing under first the laws of Moses and then increasingly under the man-made rules of the scribes and Pharisees. This is not to say that it was open slather, far from it. The preaching lectures that we find in the book of Acts show the apostles repeating the same central, essential, vital truths that all Christians are required to accept as the basis of fellowship. And those principles were never watered down or compromised. But when faced with ecclesias where wrong beliefs were present, Paul urged the members to show patience with those who were weak in the faith and gently instruct them in the right way. Yes, he stood firm against those who deliberately taught wrong doctrine and defied apostolic authority, but his primary goal was always unity, and he never suggested that division was the best way of achieving this. And the unity that Paul strove for was not superficial unity, a vague general consensus on 2 or 3 simplistic bullet points, nor was it false unity, mindless conformity imposed top-down by authority. Paul exhorted his fellow believers to genuine unity, unity of mind, unity of purpose, unity of relationship. And how does Paul define this unity? Come to Ephesians 4, verse 1. I, therefore, the prisoner for the Lord, urge you to live worthily of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one baptism, just as you too were called to the one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Look at the key words here. Live worthily, humility, gentleness, patience, love, making every effort, unity, bond, peace, one body, one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. These are the essential ingredients for a vibrant, loving, thriving household of faith. Nowhere does Paul give us license to divide our community. We never find him urging ecclesias to cut each other off. He does not whip ecclesial leaders into a witch-hunting frenzy. He does not pursue vendettas against those who have wronged him. He never abuses his authority. We might say, well, Paul was overwhelmingly loved and respected throughout the Christian community. We're just regular people. It's not so easy for us to follow his example. But remember Paul's past. He was a Pharisee, a persecutor, a murderer. Who of us here carries that kind of baggage? And how would we respond to a new convert entering our community with that kind of baggage? We like to think we would do the right thing. But how many of us has actually been in that situation? Faced with a murderer who persecuted Christians and was proud of it, and now claims he's changed his ways. He's become one of us. and everything has to be left in that dark past. Could we do it? Paul had to live with this stain on his character and the prejudice it attracted for the rest of his life as a Christian. Everyone knew about it. Many people would have struggled with it. Paul himself could not even join the Christian community until he was reconciled to it. And he still faced considerable opposition from opponents in various ecclesias. People lied about him. People spread false accusations about him. People resisted his authority. People claimed he was setting himself up as a super apostle. People claimed he was collecting money ostensibly for the poor, but really keeping it for himself. Paul could easily have become another Cain under these circumstances. So when he urges his fellow Christians to love, forgiveness, and unity, he speaks from deep, profound, personal experience. He's basically saying, show to each other the extraordinary grace that you showed me when I first became a follower of Christ. And that's a big ask. But it's not impossible, and it's no less than we ask of God every Sunday. And if we expect it from him, we cannot deny it to others. The final message of Cain and Abel's story is found in its parallel to Christ's redeeming work. Sin brings death. Redemption requires forgiveness. But forgiveness is impossible without reconciliation. And Jesus distills these concepts into practical wisdom in Matthew 5, verses 21 to 24. So let's turn there now. You have heard that it was said to an older generation, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subjected to judgment. But I say to you that anyone who is angry with a brother will be subjected to judgment, and whoever insults a brother will be brought before the council, and whoever says fool will be sent to fiery hell. So then, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your gift. Look at the emphasis here. Jesus doesn't say, if you have something against your brother, go and ask him to repent before you bring your offering. Instead, he calls for self-examination. If you know that your brother has something against you, go and be reconciled before you present your gift. This is a hard commandment. Very often we find it too hard. Because human nature is inherently selfish. We're more comfortable with the idea that other people are in the wrong, that other people are responsible for the problems in our lives, that other people are the ones who need to repent, to apologize, to make amends, to change. We don't mind asking God's forgiveness. After all, he's perfect, and it's very easy to ask forgiveness from someone who is perfect. But asking forgiveness from a fellow human can be very challenging because our brothers and sisters are no better than we are. equally flawed and prone to sin. Our challenge is to resist the beast at the door and seek reconciliation with our fellow Christian in the hope that we might all be reconciled to God. I'd like to leave you with some thoughts from the Christian scholar Walter Brueggemann. Speaking in the context of Cain and Abel's story, he reminds us that reconciliation can be a daunting prospect from which we instinctively recoil because it runs contrary to human nature. Reconciliation is, in some ways, the greatest challenge of the Christian life. Brueggemann says, the miracle of new life, the wonder of resurrection, is linked to brotherly reconciliation. That is what passing from death to life is about, 1 John 3:14. But life with the brother is so ominous because of the waiting one, the crouching one. Most days we would choose death rather than to face the brother. But the gospel is uncompromising. The promises are linked to the brother and will be had no other way. It is a mystery that the gift of new life is so close at hand, present in the neighbour. So close at hand, but so resisted. We do not readily embrace such a mystery. Perhaps that is the reason sin waits so eagerly.